I want to be precise about the day I stopped trusting the scanner. Not because the machine failed me. It didn't. The scanner did exactly what it was built to do. It read the electromagnetic signature of the object ahead of us, cross-referenced that signature against the Syndicate's 47-volume asset catalog, and returned a match. Human Industrial Complex, class designation unknown, status derelict, last VERIFIED active 412 days prior, flagged for asset recovery, corridor lease claim pending tribunal review. All of that was correct, every single line of it. The scanner just didn't know what derelict meant when applied to humans. Neither did I. That is the honest record. That is what I have spent 412 days trying to put into language the Syndicate's report forms actually have columns for, and I have not succeeded, and I do not believe I ever will. The forms were built to describe things that behave the way things are supposed to behave. The ardent meridian complex did not behave the way anything is supposed to behave. I watched it happen from 42 kilometers out, strapped into the observation seat of the Asset Recovery Tender Pale Covenant, with my cataloging tablet in my lap and my stylus hovering over the intake column, where I was supposed to write the estimated salvage mass. I never wrote the number. The stylus is still in my hand, I think. I don't remember putting it down. Let me start at the beginning. That is the correct way to file a report, and even if I am never going to finish this one, starting at the beginning is a discipline I am not prepared to abandon. I was a maintenance surveyor, 3rd grade, assigned to the veteran auditing syndicate's asset recovery division, outer corridor annexation desk. My function was to accompany recovery tenders to contested or disputed sites, catalog the assets present, ships, stations, construction platforms, fuel depots, anything with mass and salvage value, and produce the formal intake documentation that allowed the syndicate's legal team to file corridor lease claims with the conclave tribunal. It was not a glamorous posting. My colleagues in the inner desk called it drift work. You went out to the cold edge of the mapped corridors. You floated next to whatever dead thing the syndicate had flagged. You counted its components and wrote down the numbers, and you came home. The things were always dead. That was the point. You did not send a 3rd-grade maintenance surveyor to audit a live installation. You sent a 3rd-grade maintenance surveyor to audit wreckage. The ardent meridian complex was not wreckage. I did not know that when the mission brief arrived on my desk. I read the file the way I read every file, quickly, looking for anomalies that would complicate the intake process, and finding none. The complex was a human installation, a deep corridor repair and maintenance depot, built at the intersection of 2 trade lanes that had been contested between the Syndicate and the Outer Compact for approximately 80 years. It was large. The file listed its gross dimensions as 4.1 kilometers on its long axis, with 6 radial maintenance arms each running approximately 900 meters, and a central drydock bay capable of accommodating hulls up to 3 kilometers in length. That was bigger than the standard depot profile. I noted it, but size alone didn't flag concern. Human installations in contested corridors tended toward the oversized. They built in redundancy the way other species built in elegance. A cultural habit the Syndicate's analysts had documented and categorized, and ultimately stopped trying to understand. The file said the complex had gone dark 412 days before our arrival. No outgoing transmissions, no beacon pulse, no navigational lighting, no drive emissions. A Syndicate survey drone had passed within 800 kilometers 11 months prior and detected no active power signature. The Conclave Tribunal had accepted this as sufficient evidence of abandonment, and the Syndicate had filed its corridor lease claim accordingly. Our job was to arrive, confirm the abandonment in person, catalog the salvageable mass, and return the paperwork so the claim could be finalized. Standard drift work. I packed my cataloging kit, filed my transit manifest, and boarded the Pale Covenant at Syndicate Way Station 9 without a second thought. There were 14 of us aboard the tender. Myself, the ship's captain, a gray-scaled veteran named Cavan, who had run recovery operations for 31 years and who spoke almost exclusively in the clipped procedural language of an operations log, and 12 salvage crew. The salvage crew were Syndicate contractors, not employees. They were paid by the kilogram of recovered mass, which meant they moved fast and asked few questions, and did not particularly enjoy being told that a site might take longer to process than expected. I had worked with them before. They were good at their jobs. They knew how to move through dead installations, cut through bulkheads, strip out the components with the highest recovery value, and get back to the tender before their air ran out. They were very skilled at everything that had nothing to do with what we encountered. We arrived at the Ardent Meridian Complex on the 44th day of our transit, coming in on a slow approach vector, as regulations required for all designated derelict sites. Cavan brought the tender in at a cautious 4 kilometers per hour, far slower than the salvage crew preferred, running full sensor sweeps every 90 seconds. I was in the observation seat doing my preliminary intake catalog, working from the file's listed components: the 6 maintenance arms, the central dry dock, the 4 external fuel manifold towers, the 11 docking cradles running along the complex's ventral face. I was counting the docking cradles when I first noticed that the file was wrong. Not about the cradles. The cradles were there. I could see all 11 of them through the observation port, dark against the blue-black of the outer corridor gas cloud, exactly as listed. I had counted them twice by the time we reached the 42-kilometer approach hold, once from the long-range scanner return, and once with my own eyes through the observation port glass, because verification is the discipline that keeps a third-grade surveyor's intake catalog accurate, and I was proud of my intake catalogs. 11 cradles, correct. The 4 fuel manifold towers on the complex's dorsal face, correct. The navigational array housing, dark, correct. The 6 maintenance arms extending radially from the central body in the y-axis configuration the file had described, correct. What the file had not mentioned, or had mentioned only in the most abstracted way, was what was sitting in them. Ships. The file had noted, in a small font supplementary appendix that I had skimmed rather than read, that the Ardent Meridian Complex had been used primarily as a maintenance and refit depot for human military vessels, and that at the time of its last confirmed active status, it had held an unspecified number of hulls awaiting scheduled maintenance cycles. I had read the words unspecified number and assumed they meant 3 or 4, perhaps 6. A working depot of that size, serving a routine corridor maintenance schedule, would not typically hold more than a handful of vessels at any given time. The economics of the thing didn't support it. You serviced the ships and you sent them back out. You didn't accumulate them. The humans had accumulated them. I counted from the observation seat, going methodically across the ventral face of the complex and working inward toward the central dry dock bay. 11 docking cradles, each holding 1 hull. 2 more vessels berthed against the inner wall of the nearest maintenance arm, too large for the standard cradles. 3 hulls visible through the open bay doors of the central dry dock, stacked in the vertical configuration I had seen in Syndicate technical documents about human shipbuilding practice, one atop the other in a gravity anchor arrangement, using the bay's infrastructure to hold them stable. And inside the other maintenance arms, I had to shift to the scanner to pick them up, because the arms were enclosed, 4 more contacts, reading as large metallic masses in the 2 to 3 kilometer range. I sat with this for a moment. 11 in the cradles, 2 against the inner wall, 3 in the dry dock, 4 in the enclosed arms, 20 hulls. I wrote the number on my tablet, then I looked at it for a while. The file had said unspecified number. I was now specifying it. 20 human military vessels in various stages of documented maintenance, sitting in a derelict installation at the edge of a contested corridor, powered down and silent and dark. My job was to catalog them, so I began. The scanner was very helpful during this part. It was doing exactly what it was supposed to do, reading each hull in turn and returning a mass estimate, a length measurement, and a drive configuration profile. The mass estimates were large. The smallest hull in the cradles came back at approximately 400,000 metric tons, which put it at roughly 1.2 kilometers in length, and the largest contact in the central dry dock returned a mass estimate the scanner's formatting system expressed in scientific notation, which I had not seen it do before. I entered the numbers into the intake column, working methodically, trying not to think too hard about the aggregate. It took me 40 minutes to catalog all 20 contacts. When I was done, I looked at the total salvage mass figure the tablet had calculated, and then I looked away from it, because the number was large enough to be a distraction. Then Orth Cavancel called down from the command deck. "Surveyor, the salvage crew wants to begin boarding. I've held them at the airlock pending your site clearance." Site clearance was my authority. In a standard recovery operation, I confirmed that the installation showed no hazardous materials, no residual drive emissions that might indicate an unstable power plant, and no structural integrity risks that could trap or kill a boarding crew. I ran through the checklist on my scanner. No hazardous materials flagged, no residual drive emissions, no structural integrity anomalies, no active power signatures anywhere in the complex. "Site cleared," I said. "Standard boarding protocol. Flag the high-mass contacts in the dry dock bay for priority assessment. They'll need a full structural survey before we can estimate extraction options." "Confirmed," Orth Cavancel said. "Crew deploying in 8 minutes." I went back to my catalog. There was a great deal of secondary material to document: the fuel manifold towers, the external utility conduits running between the maintenance arms, the navigational array housing on the complex's dorsal surface. I worked through it methodically. The salvage crew cycled through the tender's airlock in 2 groups, their magnetic boots and cutting equipment clanking against the Pale Covenant's hull as they transferred to their own small boarding craft. I watched them cross the gap on the observation port's secondary display. 8 small bright points moving through the dark toward the complex's main access port on the ventral face, between the 4th and 5th docking cradles. They reached the access port. One of the crew, Selveth, the senior contractor, a heavy-set operative who moved through dead installations with the unhurried efficiency of long experience, ran the standard bypass on the external lock. It took him 4 minutes. The airlock cycled. The team went in. I was cataloging the fuel manifold towers when Selveth's voice came over the crew channel. "Surveyor, you're going to want to see this." I looked up from my tablet. The crew channel carried a feed from Selveth's helmet recorder. The image showed a corridor wide, low ceilinged by the standards of most species I had worked with, built for humans with their particular proportions and their preference for straight lines and unadorned functional surfaces. The corridor lighting was off, which was expected for a derelict site. Selveth's helmet lamp threw a sharp cone of white light forward. What I was looking at was not the corridor. It was the corridor walls. Every tool, every component, every piece of maintenance equipment that should have been racked or stored or removed had instead been worked on. That was the only word I had for it. The wall racks were full of parts in intermediate stages of assembly. Conduits that had been disconnected and rerouted. Junction panels open, their internal wiring arranged with a precision that looked less like repair work and more like preparation. Selveth moved his helmet lamp slowly across the nearest rack, and I could see the components clearly: drive coupling brackets, power relay housings, weapons system junction blocks in the Syndicate's own categorization format. And every single one of them was in better condition than the file's maintenance records had described. "How long has this been derelict?" Selveth asked. He was not asking me, he was asking the corridor. 412 days per the file," I said. "What is the atmospheric reading?" Standard nitrogen-oxygen mix, slightly cold, 0.3 below human standard. A pause, no dust on the equipment racks. I wrote that down. I did not immediately understand why I wrote it down. It seemed important and I couldn't place why, and my training told me that when something seemed important and you couldn't place why, you wrote it down before the moment passed. No dust on the equipment racks, in a derelict installation, after 412 days. I knew what dust accumulation looked like in dead installations. In 31 operations, I had cataloged 17 sites that had been dark for more than a year, and the dust was always there, thin on the vertical surfaces, thick on the horizontal ones, thickest on the equipment racks where the flat upper surfaces of components and tools collected the slow drift of particulate matter that settled when filtration systems stopped. It was how you calibrated how long a place had truly been empty. Not by the logs, which could be falsified or lost, but by the dust layer on the rack surfaces, which was a clock that did not lie. The ardent meridian complex did not have that clock, which meant either the filtration systems had been running recently enough to have cleared the accumulation, or they had never stopped running, and neither of those was consistent with an installation that had ceased all outgoing transmissions 412 days prior. A machine that was truly dead did not run its filtration. A machine that was running its filtration was not truly dead. I did not connect this thought to its conclusion in the moment. I wrote it down and moved on, which is what driftwork trained you to do: note the anomaly, continue the process, resolve the discrepancy in the write-up later. I did not work out what it meant until much later, sitting in the Syndicate debriefing room on the 49th day after departure, when one of the senior administrators asked me if there had been any early indicator that the installation was not truly derelict. I told him about the dust. He stared at me with the expression of someone who had just been given a very simple answer to a question he had been making complicated, and then he wrote something in his notes that I was not positioned to read. Continue interior survey, I said. Document all interior conditions. Do not touch anything until the full survey is complete. Copy, Selveth said. I turned back to my scanner. I ran the external sweep again, a full passive sweep, all bands. Nothing. No power emissions. No communication signals. No drive activity. The complex was reading exactly as dark as it had read on every sweep since we arrived. The crew moved deeper into the installation. I watched the helmet recorder feed on my secondary display while I worked the catalog, one eye on each, the way driftwork trained you to split your attention. The interior conditions were consistent throughout the sections Selveth's team accessed, clean, cold, carefully organized, with that same quality of deliberate preparation that I had no Syndicate category for. The corridors were clear. The work bays were clean. The internal drydock access hatches were sealed but functional, the manual overrides in full working order, which Selveth noted because at derelict installations, manual overrides were usually the first things to degrade. It was in the fourth corridor section that Selveth found the window. It was not remarkable as windows went, a standard human installation viewport, approximately 60 centimeters across, set into the interior wall of the corridor at roughly head height for a human standing upright. It overlooked the central drydock bay from a maintenance walkway level. Selveth stopped in front of it, and his helmet lamp lit the interior of the bay. The three hulls in the bay were visible from this angle. The scanner had registered them as large metallic masses. Looking at them through the viewport, with Selveth's lamp providing a narrow reference point for scale, I revised my understanding of large upward considerably. The bottom hull, the one in the lowest cradle position, its keel resting on the bay's gravity anchor infrastructure, was not 3 kilometers long. It was closer to 4. The scanner had been reading through the upper two hulls and averaging the returns. I looked at the hull's visible surface from Selveth's angle, dark gray, heavily weathered in the specific way that human military vessels weathered, which was less like corrosion and more like accumulation, layer upon layer of scorch marks, impact scoring, replated sections where hull material had been replaced over what must have been years of operational use. The weapon emplacements were covered, which meant the covering plates were what the scanner had been reading as smooth hull sections. I counted 14 of them on the visible face of the hull's forward third. Just the forward third, just one face. Selveth stood very still in front of the viewport. "Surveyor," he said, "is there a classification in the Syndicate catalog for a hull this size?" "The largest human vessel in the catalog is listed at 2.9 kilometers, I said. "It was a construction tender, decommissioned approximately 90 years ago." "This isn't a construction tender." "No," I said, "it is not." A silence. "What do you want us to do?" I thought about that for longer than I should have. My job was to catalog and document. The question of what the salvage crew did next was technically Orith Cavansell's decision, not mine, but the captain had been waiting on my assessment and I had not yet given it. The installation was derelict. The scanner said so. The site clearance had passed. The crew was inside. The correct procedure, from the standpoint of the Syndicate's Asset Recovery Division, was to complete the interior survey, document all high-mass contacts, and begin the preliminary extraction feasibility assessment for the highest value items, which now clearly included the hulls in the central dry dock. "Complete the interior survey," I said. "Document all contacts. Do not attempt any extraction or hull access without a full structural clearance." "Copy," Selveth said. He turned away from the viewport. I went back to my scanner. I want to be clear about what the scanner was telling me at this point in the record, because it matters for what came next. The scanner was telling me nothing. No power emissions anywhere in the complex. No drive activity. No communications. No life signs, which was expected, since a derelict installation would not have life signs. No anomalous heat signatures. No vibration in the complex's structural members that would indicate active machinery. Nothing. So when 40 minutes later, the scanner registered the first anomaly, I noticed it immediately because it was the first deviation from a baseline I had now been reading for approximately 3 hours. It was small, a faint increase in the thermal signature from the complex's central power conduit network, the grid of heavy cabling that ran through the installation's walls and connected its various systems to the central reactor housing. In a standard derelict, those conduits would be cold. The Syndicate's survey drone had confirmed cold conduits 11 months prior. They were now reading fractionally warmer than cold. Not warm, not hot, fractionally warmer than cold. The difference was measurable in hundredths of a degree. I stared at the reading for a moment, and then I opened the crew channel. "Selveth, I need your team to move to the access port and prepare to exit the installation." His response was immediate: "Problem. Possible anomaly in the power grid thermal profile. Precautionary measure. Please begin moving now." "How long do we have?" "I don't know. Please move now." There was a brief pause, the kind of pause an experienced salvage contractor makes when they are evaluating whether to argue. And then Selveth said, "Copy. Moving." And I heard the sound of boots on metal flooring, unhurried but deliberate. I was watching the thermal readings. They were rising. Not quickly, precisely. The kind of rise that is not a runaway process, not a failure, not an accident. A rise that follows a curve, shallow, controlled, exactly the curve that a reactor would follow if someone had programmed it to come up to operational temperature at a specific rate over a specific period of time. I had seen this curve in Syndicate technical documents about planned restart procedures for mothballed installations. You didn't just ignite a reactor that had been cold for 400 days. You brought it up slowly, letting the system equilibrate, preventing thermal stress fractures in the containment architecture. The Ardent Meridian Complex was performing a planned reactor restart. "Orith Cavansell," I said, "I need you to begin withdrawal procedures. Move the tender to at least 10 kilometers from the complex." The captain's voice was completely flat. "The crew is still inside." "I know. They are moving to the access port. Please begin the withdrawal calculation now so we are ready to move the moment they reboard." A pause that lasted exactly long enough for Orith Cavancel to look at the same scanner data I was looking at. Then, "Understood. Calculating." I went back to watching the thermal curve. It was 8 minutes after I had called the crew out that the complex's navigational lighting came on. Not all of it at once. That was not how human installations brought their systems up, and by this point I was paying attention to how human installations brought their systems up. It started at the dorsal array, a single strip of white navigation markers running along the complex's upper spine, and spread from there outward along the maintenance arms, one section at a time, in a sequence that matched the power grid topology I had been watching on my scanner. The complex was illuminating itself in the order that its power distribution network reached each section. The darkness around the ardent meridian complex had lasted 412 days. It took 11 minutes and 40 seconds to end. When the last navigation strip came on, the ventral cradle lighting, running along the underside of the installation between the docking cradles and casting a pale blue-white wash across the 11 hulls berthed there, I sat in the observation seat and did not write anything on my tablet. I just looked at it through the observation port. The complex was lit. It was enormous. Fully lit at 42 kilometers, it occupied a significant fraction of the port observation port's field of view. Then, one by one, the hulls in the docking cradles lit up too. Not their navigation lights, their running lights, the full operational lighting of vessels in active service, interior lights coming on behind their viewports, engine ports going from cold black to the deep amber warmth of idling drives. The first one took 3 minutes after the complex lit up. The second one started 4 minutes after the first, then the third, then the fourth and fifth almost simultaneously, then 2 more. Then, in what I now understand was the time required for the gravity anchor infrastructure in the central dry dock to reconfigure for independent separation, the 3 hulls in the bay, each in their own sequence, their lights coming up from the bottommost to the topmost as if the bay itself was exhaling. All 11 cradle hulls and all 3 dry dock hulls were powered and lit within 31 minutes of the complex's navigational lighting coming on. The 2 hulls berthed against the inner maintenance arm wall added another 9 minutes. And I watched this on the scanner because the enclosed arms blocked direct observation. The 4 hulls in the maintenance arms powered up in sequence, their heat signatures blooming through the arm structures like warmth spreading through cold metal. 20 human military vessels, at various stages of readiness, powering up in a derelict installation that the veteran auditing syndicate had flagged for asset recovery 412 days after its last confirmed transmission. Selveth's team reached the access port 5 minutes into this process. They reboarded the Pale Covenant in a state of silence that I had never heard from a salvage crew before. These were contractors who had worked dead installations for decades. They had seen things as fires in derelict reactors, automated systems unexpectedly activating, structural collapses, all the hazards of the profession. They came back through the tender's airlock without speaking a single word to each other or to me, and they went to the crew compartment, and they strapped themselves in, and they sat there. Orith Cavancel had the tender's approach thrusters running before the last of them was through the airlock. 10 kilometers, I said. Already moving, the captain said. The withdrawal took 18 minutes at a steady 2G acceleration. We did not look away from the ardent meridian complex during those 18 minutes. We did not talk. The scanner ran continuous sweeps and I watched the data build on my display. The power signatures from the complex climbing, vessel by vessel, from dormant to active to operational. The drive emissions beginning as faint traces and thickening into full operational profiles, as each hull ran its startup sequence. At the 10-kilometer mark, Orithcavan Cell stopped the tender and held position. The complex was still illuminated ahead of us, still quiet on communications. No hails, no warnings, no broadcast on any standard corridor traffic frequency. 20 hulls powered and lit and quiet, sitting in their berths, their drives idling. It was at this point that I realized the Syndicate fleet had arrived. I say arrived, but they had been there. I had not been watching the approach channel during the prior 3 hours, which was a lapse I cannot fully defend, except to say that I was busy cataloging what I had believed to be a dead installation. The recovery fleet had been scheduled to arrive in our operational corridor approximately 2 hours after the Pale Covenant, and they had done so. 180 vessels, the standard Syndicate asset recovery enforcement configuration for a large contested corridor claim. 12 escort frigates in the vanguard formation, 40 heavy salvage platforms in mid-fleet, the remainder in support and logistics roles. They had been holding at 60 kilometers from the complex, running the standard observation protocol, waiting for my clearance to advance. Commander Vethos Saril of the lead escort frigate Bright Theorem opened the fleet channel at this point. Surveyor Kethosavar, we are observing active power signatures from the target installation. Please clarify site status. I looked at my tablet. The intake column for estimated salvage mass was still blank, the stylus hovering over it in my hand. Commander, I said, the site is not derelict. I recommend the fleet maintain current distance and wait. Wait for what? I did not know how to answer that. I had been trying to form the answer for the last 31 minutes, so I said the most honest thing I could, which was, I don't know, but I would wait. Commander Vethos Saril had 31 years of operational command. I was a third-grade surveyor. The Syndicate's asset recovery protocols gave him clear authority over my recommendation, and the fleet had a corridor lease claim on record with the Conclave Tribunal, and 180 warships behind him, and the installation's last verified status in the Syndicate's records was still derelict. He brought the fleet forward. I want to be careful here, because I am trying to produce a record that is accurate rather than one that puts what happened in the framework that makes the most sense to me personally, which is not always the same thing as accurate. Commander Vethos Saril was not reckless. He was following protocol. The Syndicate's protocol for contested corridor asset recovery was explicit. When a claim is on record and the asset is present and the enforcement fleet is on station, you advance and you secure the asset. You do not hold at 60 kilometers because a third-grade surveyor thinks you should wait. I might have given him a clearer briefing of what I was observing. I did not. I said the site is not derelict and I recommend waiting, and when he declined my recommendation, I did not push harder. I watched the fleet advance. They came in on a standard approach formation. The 12 escort frigates spread in a broad fan ahead of the main body, the salvage platforms and support vessels following in an elongated column. Efficient, professional, exactly the formation that 180 Syndicate vessels would use to approach a large contested corridor installation for asset recovery. The lead frigates reached the 20-kilometer mark and held, broadcasting the standard Syndicate asset claim declaration on all corridor traffic frequencies. The declaration stated, in the formal language of the Conclave Tribunal's recovery protocols, that the Ardent Meridian Complex was the subject of a valid Syndicate corridor lease claim, that all personnel and assets within the complex were required to cooperate with the Syndicate's recovery operation, and that resistance would be met with appropriate enforcement response. The complex did not respond. The fleet advanced to 15 kilometers. The complex was still quiet, all 20 hulls still in their berths, drives idling, running lights on. The scanner showed me each of them clearly now that the power was up. The drive emissions were clean and strong, the profiles consistent with vessels at operational readiness rather than idle standby, and I noted this because it was a data point that the Syndicate's protocol categories did not have a good slot for. A vessel at operational readiness is different from a vessel at idle standby in the same way that a raised fist is different from a hand at rest. The technical distinction is in the power routing. The practical distinction is in what comes next. I noted it. I did not transmit it to the fleet channel. I have thought about this in the 412 days since. I do not know if transmitting it would have changed anything. The fleet advanced to 12 kilometers. At 11.4 kilometers, the complex responded. The response was not on communications frequencies. There was no transmission. What happened was this. The 11 hulls in the docking cradles released from their berths simultaneously, not one at a time. All 11 together, in a coordinated release that the scanner registered as a single event. The magnetic clamps on all 11 cradles disengaging in the same half-second. 11 hulls drifting free of the installation's ventral face at once, their maneuvering thrusters firing to push them clear of the cradle structure. From 42 kilometers, watching on the scanner and on the observation port, this is what it looked like. The ventral face of the Ardent Meridian complex opened. 11 lights detaching from a larger structure and spreading apart in space, each one moving with the deliberate efficiency of a vessel that knows exactly where it is going. They did not go toward the fleet immediately. They formed up first. I have thought about this a great deal in the 412 days since it happened, and I still cannot decide whether the time they took to form up, approximately 4 minutes, during which the Syndicate fleet held position at 12 kilometers, and Commander Vethos Saril attempted to raise any human signal on any available frequency, was a tactical necessity or a choice. Whether the humans needed those 4 minutes to establish their formation, or whether they took those 4 minutes deliberately, knowing that every second of watching that formation coalesce would cost the Syndicate fleet something it could not get back. The formation, when it was established, was a simple one. The 11 hulls from the cradles arranged themselves in 2 lines, 7 in the forward line, 4 in the rear, spread across a front of approximately 18 kilometers. Behind them, emerging from the central drydock bay, which had opened along its full length during the formation process, the 3 large hulls added themselves to the array, not to the lines. They took position behind the lines, in echelon, staggered to either side of the fleet's central axis. And then the 4 hulls from the maintenance arms came out. I had not thought much about the 4 hulls in the maintenance arms during the formation process, because the arms had been blocking my direct observation, and the scanner had been busy tracking the more dramatic emergence of the 11 cradle hulls. The 4 maintenance arm hulls had been the second largest mass contacts in the original catalog, second only to the 3 drydock hulls, and I had flagged them for structural survey and moved on, giving them less attention than they deserved. When the maintenance arm outer bays opened and the 4 hulls emerged, I understood why the complex had been built with arms 900 meters long, 3 kilometers each, at minimum. The scanner was having difficulty with the return at this range because the hull's active drive emissions were producing interference. I could see them directly through the observation port, though, as they cleared the arm bays and accelerated forward to take their positions at the outer flanks of the human formation. Enormous, dark, weathered to the specific gray-black of a vessel that has spent a very long time in operational conditions, each one carrying weapon array profiles that the scanner was simply reporting as multiple contacts, classification unavailable because it did not have a format for what it was seeing. The human formation complete. 18 hulls in the main line and echelon arrangement, ranging from approximately 1.2 kilometers to 4 kilometers in length. 2 additional large hulls I had miscounted at the drydock. There were not 3 but 4, positioned at the extreme flanks. The 2 remaining hulls, the ones berthed against the inner maintenance arm wall which I had logged early and then largely ignored, emerged last. They were the smallest vessels in the formation, each approximately 900 meters in length. They did not join the main line. They moved instead to a position directly between the human formation and the Pale Covenant, and they held there. Not between us and any threat, between us and the humans. As if they were ensuring that whatever happened next, the tender would have an unobstructed exit path. I do not know if that is what that positioning meant. I am recording what I observed. The Syndicate fleet, 180 vessels, holding at 12 kilometers, had not moved since the formation process began. Commander Vethos Sarel had been broadcasting on all frequencies throughout. No response from the human formation. The formation finished. 20 human warships in the silence of the outer corridor. I became aware at some point during this process that I had put down the stylus. I do not remember putting it down. I want to record what the formation looked like at completion, because I believe it is relevant data, and because I have not seen it described accurately in any of the Syndicate's official records of the incident, which I have read subsequently. The official records describe the human vessels as a fleet of mixed-class warships in a combat formation. This is technically accurate and substantially misleading. What the formation looked like was not a collection of ships that had been assembled for this moment. It looked like the product of a long time. The hulls were not uniform. They varied in length, in configuration, in hull profile, in the specific character of their weathering. But they moved as a single organism, the way a formation moves when it has practiced this exact geometry, until the geometry is reflex rather than instruction. The 7 forward hulls held their spacing to within tolerances that the scanner could measure, but I could not see the individual deviations of. When the 3 large echelon hulls shifted position by approximately 800 meters to improve their line of sight to the fleet's main body, the adjustment was made by all 3 simultaneously, and the new spacing was as precise as the old one. This was not a fleet assembled from vessels that happened to be present in a repair depot. This was a fleet that had been working together in this formation for a very long time, in a depot the Syndicate had catalogued as derelict, running silent. Waiting, that is the word. I became aware at some point during this process that I had put down the stylus. I do not remember the moment it happened. What happened over the next 19 minutes and 41 seconds, I am going to try to record accurately, without the kind of compression that would make it feel more orderly than it was, because the truth of it was that it was not orderly. Not from the Syndicate fleet's perspective. Not from my perspective at 42 kilometers. Not from the scanner's perspective, which had by the halfway point of those 19 minutes essentially given up on presenting me with clean data, and was returning fragmented partial readings that I was interpreting as best I could. The human formation moved at 3 minutes and 12 seconds, not toward the fleet, laterally, adjusting their position relative to the complex, opening the angle between the 2 lines so that the rear 4 hulls had clear field separation from the front 7. A tactical adjustment, the kind a coherent fleet makes when it is preparing for something. The Syndicate formation mirrored it automatically, the 12 escort frigates spreading slightly to cover the changed front. This is standard fleet doctrine, and the Syndicate frigates executed it correctly. I think executing it correctly was a mistake. The human forward line had not moved laterally to open their own field separation. They had moved laterally to close the Syndicate frigates' field separation. When the frigates spread to mirror the human adjustment, they moved into the spacing the human formation needed to isolate them. The front 7 hulls fired at 6 minutes and 40 seconds. I am going to be careful here, because the word fired is doing a great deal of work, and I do not want to let it do so uncritically. What the scanner recorded was a series of directed energy discharges of very high intensity over a period of approximately 4 seconds. What I saw through the observation port was a series of very brief, very bright events in the space between the human forward line and the Syndicate frigates. The brightnesses lasted fractions of a second each. They were not the prolonged sustained fire that the Syndicate's own weapons systems produced. They were short, precise, each one appearing and ending before my eye could fully track it. After those 4 seconds, 9 of the 12 Syndicate escort frigates were no longer returning scanner contacts. I want to be precise. They were not damaged. They were not retreating. They were not returning distress signals or emitting debris clouds or doing any of the things a vessel does when it has been hit and survived. They were simply not where they had been as a scanner contact, and they were not anywhere else either. The scanner had no category for this. I sat there looking at scanner returns for vessels that were not in them and could not find a word for what I was looking at. The remaining 3 frigates fired. I logged this because it happened, and I am making a record. The Syndicate frigate weapons systems were among the most capable in the Conclave's standard classification framework. I had never had any reason to think otherwise. The human formation was approximately 12 kilometers from the frigates when they fired. I watched the frigate weapons impacts on the scanner. They registered. The human forward line sensor profiles flickered briefly as each impact was absorbed. None of the 7 hulls altered course. None of them reduced drive emissions. None of them changed the geometry of their approach. The 3 frigates lasted 47 additional seconds after that. At this point, the main Syndicate fleet, the 40 salvage platforms and the supporting vessels, had begun emergency withdrawal maneuvering. This was the correct decision, and Vethos Sarel made it in time to matter for some of them. The salvage platforms were not warships. They were large, slow, designed for mass handling and extended dockside operations. They were not built to move quickly in an emergency withdrawal. They began to move at 8 minutes and 20 seconds after the human forward line's first engagement, and they were not going to achieve safe distance quickly. What followed, and I am going to describe this as plainly as I can, without the register I would normally use for catalog entry, because plain is the most honest, was a dismantling. That is the word I have come to use. Not a battle, not even a one-sided engagement in the standard sense, because the word engagement implies that both parties were attempting to impose their will on each other, and I am not certain the humans were trying to impose their will on the Syndicate fleet in the way that phrase means. I think, and I cannot be certain, and this is the interpretation of a third-grade maintenance surveyor with no military training. I think the humans were trying to be thorough. The 7 forward hulls engaged the main fleet body. The 4 rear hulls moved to the flanks and dealt with the vessels that had broken formation. The 3 large echelon hulls, the ones that had been in the dry dock, moved at what the scanner registered as a speed I double-checked 3 times and still do not believe, because it was not consistent with the mass profiles the scanner had given them, and covered the 8 kilometers to the dispersing salvage platforms in what felt like no time at all and was approximately 3 minutes. The 4 maintenance arm hulls did not engage. I watched them throughout the entire event. They did not fire, did not maneuver aggressively, did not close distance with any Syndicate vessel. They remained in their position at the outer formation flanks and they watched, the way a formation holds reserve and watches, and I think they were there in case something required a second effort. Nothing required a second effort. I know the final count because I was watching the scanner the entire time and counting. I counted as each Syndicate vessel ceased to register, and I wrote the number down each time, because writing numbers was the only thing I had left that felt like doing my job correctly. 167 vessels ceased to register as active contacts over the course of 19 minutes and 41 seconds. 13 vessels completed emergency withdrawal and reached the minimum safe distance that the scanner defined as out of engagement range. I watched all 13 of them still on the scanner at the end of the event, their drive signatures elevated with emergency thrust, moving away from the operational corridor as fast as their respective hull types allowed. One of them was the Bright Theorem. Then the human formation reformed. This is the part of the record I have the most trouble writing accurately, not because I did not observe it clearly, but because what I observed does not have a context I can place it in. When the 19 minutes and 41 seconds were done, and the human formation had completed whatever process the word dismantling applies to, they turned back to the ardent meridian complex. Not quickly, not in the rushed, compressed way that ships move when they are returning to a safe haven after a difficult operation. Slowly, in formation, the way a fleet comes home at the end of a scheduled exercise. The 7 forward hulls returned first, and as they closed on the complex, I watched the docking cradle lighting shift, specific cradles illuminating in sequence, as if the complex already knew which hull was assigned to which berth and was lighting them in order of arrival. The hulls docked. Their running lights shifted from the full bright of operational status to the amber-dimmed idling of a berthed vessel. The others followed, one by one, in the unhurried sequence of a fleet returning from routine operations. The 4 large hulls from the maintenance arms went back into their arms last, and the arm outer bay doors closed behind them. I watched the process from 42 kilometers. Orith Cavancel had not moved the tender. The 2 small hulls that had positioned themselves between the complex and us were still in their position between the complex and us, and this was the reason, I believed then and I believe now, that neither of us suggested retreating. They were not threatening us. They were simply present, in that specific position, and it seemed clear to me at least that the intent of their presence was that we were being permitted to watch, and that we were being held here until watching was done. The last hull docked, its running lights dimmed. The complex lights did not go out. The navigational strips remained on. The complex was lit and quiet and enormous, exactly as it had been before the formation deployed, and from 42 kilometers it looked precisely as it had looked 37 minutes before. An installation in operation, fully powered, going about its business. Then the 2 small hulls between us, and the complex turned and went back to their berths. They docked without ceremony. Their airlock lights cycled once, the brief double flash of a standard pressurization confirmation, and then they were still. I sat in the observation seat for a while after that. I don't know how long. What caused me to begin thinking about writing this record, not immediately, but eventually, over the days that followed our return to Syndicate Way Station 9, when I was sitting in the debriefing rooms answering questions from people with much higher Syndicate rank than me who were also trying to find the right form to put this in, was a thing I saw in the last minutes before the 2 small hulls returned to their berths. There was a viewport in the complex's dorsal maintenance section. I had seen it on our initial approach, a standard installation viewport, larger than the corridor one Selveth's team had passed on their interior survey, approximately 2 meters across, set into the outer hull of the complex's primary operations block at a level that would correspond to the human interior working level I had seen documented in Syndicate technical files. It was not a command viewport. It was too far back on the hull for that. It was the kind of viewport a working installation puts in an interior maintenance corridor, so the people doing the work can look outside while they do it. There was someone standing in it. At 42 kilometers, with the observation port's maximum optical magnification, I could not resolve the figure well. Human proportions, I knew that much, from the reference material. Suited, in what looked like a standard maintenance environment suit rather than an armored one. Standing at the viewport with both hands at their sides, not braced against anything, not appearing to watch the departing 2-hull escort with any visible urgency. Just standing at the viewport, looking out. I do not know if they were looking at us. The optical resolution at 42 kilometers was not sufficient to determine eye direction. I am logging that I observed a human figure standing at an interior viewport on the complex's dorsal operations block, that the figure appeared to be in a maintenance environment suit, and that the figure appeared to be looking outward, and that this observation occurred in the final minutes before the 2 remaining hulls returned to berth, and that after a period of observation, the figure turned away from the viewport, and the viewport was empty. Then Orith Cavancel said, "Surveyor, do you want to file the site clearance?" I looked at my tablet. The intake column was blank. "No," I said, "I do not." We returned to Syndicate Way Station 9 on the 44th day after departure, which was the same transit time outbound. I filed the preliminary report of the incident with the Asset Recovery Division. I attended 11 debriefing sessions with progressively more senior syndicate administrators. I answered every question they asked me, as accurately as I could, and when they asked me questions, I did not have accurate answers to. I said so rather than guessing. They were not pleased by this, but they did not appear pleased by any of the answers I gave, accurate or otherwise, so I do not think my honesty materially affected the quality of their discomfort. The senior administrator in the 7th session, a compact, precise individual named Orith Vassal Dim, from the Syndicate's Strategic Assessment Office, who wore a rank insignia I did not recognize and who asked better questions than any of the others, spent 3 hours going through my scanner log with me, data point by data point. He wanted to understand the thermal curve. He asked me to describe it several times from different angles, what it looked like, what the rate of change was at each stage, what I had inferred from it when I was watching it in real time versus what I understood it to mean in retrospect. I told him both. He wrote a great deal down. At the end of the 3rd hour he asked, "At any point during your approach or survey, did the installation at any point communicate with you or attempt to communicate with you?" I told him no. No transmissions on any frequency I could detect, no light signals, no physical contact, nothing. He wrote something else down. "Was there any point," he said, "at which you had the sense that the installation or the vessels within it were aware of your presence?" I thought about this for a long time. He waited. He was very good at waiting. "Yes," I said finally, "the entire time." He looked up from his notes. "From the moment we reached the approach hold," I said. "From the first sensor sweep. I cannot explain why I believe this. There was no data point I could point to that confirmed it, but I believed from the first sweep that whatever was in that installation knew we were there and had made a decision about what to do about us, and that the decision was to allow us to proceed." He wrote this down. "And the 2 small hulls," he said, "the ones that positioned between your tender and the main formation." "Yes." "You believe that was deliberate?" "I believe that was deliberate," I said. He closed his notebook. He did not ask me any more questions in that session. What I did not do, and this is the record I am making now, for whatever purpose a record made by a 3rd-grade maintenance surveyor has, is file the asset intake form for the Ardent Meridian Complex. The form is still in my tablet. The intake column for estimated salvage mass is still blank. The stylus was on my desk for the first 3 days after I returned, and then it was in a drawer, and then I stopped noticing where it was. The form has a mandatory completion deadline of 90 days from site visit. I am now past 400 days. The Asset Recovery Division has sent me 14 reminder notices. I have not responded to any of them. I am trying to decide what to write in the column. The form requires a number. It requires, specifically, a number in the format of a mass estimate, expressed in the Syndicate's standard metric for salvageable hull tonnage, to 3 significant figures, and my job, my function. The thing I was trained and posted and paid to do is to produce that number from the observations I made at the site. I made the observations. I have the scanner data. I could produce the number. I could write in the estimated salvage mass column, 0, not because there was no mass there, because I am not able to write anything else, because the Syndicate's form has a column for mass and a column for condition status and a column for extraction feasibility, and none of them, not one, have a value I can enter for what I observed at the Ardent Meridian Complex without the entry being a lie. The mass is there. The hulls are there. The installation is there. lit and operational, 412 days after the Syndicate's own survey drone said there was nothing to see. The form does not have a column for "This was never derelict" or "They were waiting" or "The scanner told me the truth about everything except the most important thing" or "I watched a maintenance worker turn away from a viewport and go back to work, and I think that is the most important data point I collected on the entire visit, and I do not know what to do with it." So the form is blank. I have been offered a transfer to the inner desk. The Asset Recovery Division has apparently decided that my continued presence on the outer corridor annexation desk is not useful to their operations, and they are probably right. I have not accepted the transfer. I have not declined it either. I am sitting with it the way I sat with the scanner readings at the 10-kilometer mark, trying to find a category for it and failing. My colleague Drevaseth, who has been with the inner desk for 12 years, and who has never been to the outer corridors, and who is a very capable surveyor, asked me recently what the Ardent Meridian complex looked like from 42 kilometers when all 20 hulls were in their berths and the navigational lighting was on. I told him it looked like an installation that had never stopped running. He asked what I meant. I told him I meant whatever the Syndicate's drone saw 11 months before our arrival, and whatever the complex's silence for 412 days meant, it did not mean what the Syndicate's records say it meant. The installation was never quiet because it was dead. It was quiet because it was working. There is a difference between a machine that is broken and silent and a machine that is running silent, and I spent my entire professional career learning to catalog the first kind, and the Ardent Meridian complex was the second kind, and I did not know that until it lit itself up at 42 kilometers, and I could not find a column for it in a form I have now been avoiding for 412 days. He looked at me for a moment, and then he went back to his desk. I went back to my form. The intake column is still blank. There is a figure standing at a viewport in my head, in a maintenance environment suit, with both hands at their sides, looking out at 42 kilometers of dark corridor, at a Syndicate tender that came to catalog what it thought was a dead thing. She does not wave. She turns back to her work. That is the entire report. That is all I have.